What could possibly drive someone to murder more than 600 innocent girls? The answer might be one of the most disturbing motivations in all of history: vanity. In 16th century Hungary, there lived one of Europe's most powerful women. She was related to kings, commanded vast estates, and had hundreds of servants at her disposal. Wealth, power, influence, she had it all. But there was one thing she wanted above everything else: eternal youth. And when she realized she couldn't buy it, she decided to take it by force. For over 2 decades, this woman carried out a campaign of torture and murder, convinced that the blood of young girls held the key to stopping time itself. Her castle became a prison of nightmares. Her servants became accomplices, and her victims, helpless young peasants, became ingredients in a twisted beauty ritual. She believed she could preserve her youth by bathing in virgin blood. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and she nearly got away with becoming Europe's most prolific serial killer. Elizabeth was born into privilege in 1560, but her upbringing was anything but ordinary. The Bathory family was infamous throughout Hungary. They weren't just royalty, they were feared. Generations of her relatives were known for cruelty, erratic behavior, and ruthless schemes. Brutality wasn't just tolerated in the family, it was tradition. From a young age, Elizabeth was surrounded by both luxury and violence. Castles filled with servants and fine gowns were also filled with torture chambers and public executions. For the Bathorys, pain and power were inseparable. Where others might have been horrified, young Elizabeth seemed fascinated. By age 11, she was already promised in marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy, a powerful Hungarian noble and military commander nicknamed the Black Knight of Hungary. Their union in 1575 sealed her position as one of the most influential women in Europe. But the stories that followed her childhood are deeply unsettling. Elizabeth was said to watch executions with disturbing curiosity, focusing on the faces of prisoners as they died, as though studying suffering itself. While other children played with dolls, Elizabeth's games were darker, early glimpses of the cruelty she would unleash later in life. Her husband, Ferenc, was often away fighting wars against the Ottomans, leaving Elizabeth in charge of their castle and estates. But Ferenc was no gentle partner himself. He had earned his nickname, the Black Knight, through acts of battlefield cruelty, impaling prisoners and leaving them to die slowly. Some historians suggest he shared torture techniques with Elizabeth during his visits home. And unlike most couples, who might swap recipes or family traditions, these two seemed to bond over increasingly brutal methods of punishment. But Elizabeth wasn't just learning. She was innovating. While Ferenc's cruelty was tactical, driven by war, Elizabeth's was deeply personal. She began experimenting on her servants, inventing punishments for the smallest mistakes. Break a plate? Expect hours of torment. Show up late? That might mean death. The servants were trapped. They couldn't run, couldn't report her to the authorities. They lived in a remote fortress, surrounded by forests and loyal guards. To outsiders, Elizabeth was a noble woman upholding discipline. To those inside her walls, she was turning the castle into a laboratory of sadism. Then, in 1604, Ferenc Nadasdy died. Elizabeth, now 44 years old, was left a widow. With her husband gone, no one stood in her way. She was one of the wealthiest, most powerful women in Hungary, and she was entirely unsupervised. That's when her darkest impulses truly took hold. Her castle, Cheta Castle, soon gained another name: the House of Horrors. What happened within those stone walls wasn't random violence. It was systematic. Elizabeth had a recruitment system in place. Servants would travel to nearby villages, offering peasant families jobs for their daughters as maids in the castle. To the poor, the promise of steady pay, warm beds, and regular meals seemed like salvation. Parents often thanked Elizabeth for the opportunity, but the moment those girls passed through the castle gates, they were trapped. The fortress sat high on a hill, surrounded by wilderness, with loyal guards ensuring no one escaped. Inside, the torture chamber became Elizabeth's private theater of cruelty. Devices were designed to maximize pain while keeping victims alive as long as possible. She invented her own methods, forcing girls to strip and stand outside in the snow, then scalding them with boiling water, using needles and knives in ways too grotesque to imagine, starving some to death while beating others senseless. Elizabeth was meticulous. She kept records of her victims, names, ages, villages, and the methods used. Where scholars of her time studied mathematics or philosophy, Elizabeth studied suffering. Then came her obsession with blood. It began with a simple moment. She struck a servant, and when blood splattered onto her skin, she thought it made her look younger. Real or imagined, it didn't matter. Elizabeth convinced herself that young blood was the key to eternal beauty. She escalated quickly. Girls were drained of blood like livestock, their bodies discarded in forests or shallow graves. Elizabeth bathed in their blood, convinced she had found the fountain of youth. Some accounts even suggest she drank it, mixing it with wine in a grotesque ritual of vanity. Her servants, terrified and complicit, helped carry out the murders. Whether out of fear or shared cruelty, they assisted with the killings, the disposal of bodies, and the recruitment of more victims. By the time the rumors began to spread, the death toll was already staggering. Some estimates claim she killed over 600 girls. The real number will never be known, because Elizabeth had mastered the art of making people disappear. Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror didn't just rely on her cruelty. It was protected by wealth, status, and a carefully constructed system of fear. For years, nobody dared stop her. In 16th century Europe, a noblewoman of her rank could get away with almost anything. Peasants had no legal recourse, and local officials were often either bribed or terrified into silence. Elizabeth knew how to exploit every advantage. She paid generous bribes to sheriffs, judges, and local authorities, ensuring that any rumors about disappearances would vanish quietly. Anyone who investigated too closely, whether a clerk, a minor official, or even a curious priest, suddenly disappeared. Fear became her most effective weapon. The Catholic Church also played a key role, though not intentionally. Elizabeth made lavish donations to parishes and monasteries, earning her a reputation as a devout Christian. Many priests turned a blind eye, believing her contributions justified ignoring her darker activities. Some even blessed her actions, convinced she was a pious noblewoman. This combination of money, influence, and intimidation created an almost perfect shield. Her inner circle of servants became her willing accomplices. Those who participated in the murders were rewarded with privileges and safety. Those who hesitated often became victims themselves. Elizabeth had effectively created a hierarchy of terror inside her own castle. Obey and survive, resist and die. As her obsession with youth and beauty deepened, her methods became more precise, almost ritualistic. Victims were selected based on age, usually between 12 and 18, believed to hold the purest blood. Servants were sent to villages to recruit girls under the guise of employment. Families, grateful for the opportunity, unknowingly sent their daughters to a death trap. Once inside the castle, escape was impossible. Guards ensured compliance, and the castle's remote location made it highly secure. Elizabeth's torture chambers were the core of her operation. She engineered devices to inflict maximum pain while keeping her victims alive long enough for her blood rituals. She experimented constantly, trying to perfect the effects of the blood on her own skin. She would suspend girls upside down, drain their blood into tubs, and immediately bathe in it. Convinced the warmth enhanced its rejuvenating properties. Some accounts even describe her drinking the blood, mixing it with wine or incorporating it into meals, as though it were a luxurious tonic. Her obsession was both psychological and physical. Mirrors became instruments of obsession. Her servants were trained to offer constant praise of her youthful appearance. Elizabeth created an echo chamber of delusion where the horrific reality of her actions seemed justified by imagined results. She believed herself to be achieving real, tangible effects on her aging body, yet overconfidence was her fatal flaw. For decades, her crimes remained hidden, but eventually, she overreached. She began targeting girls from minor noble families, not just peasants. These families had connections, legal rights, and the means to demand investigations. Disappearances among the aristocracy could not be ignored. Suddenly, Elizabeth's carefully constructed system of protection began to unravel. The investigation began quietly. King Matthias of Hungary ordered Elizabeth's cousin, Georgius Thurso, the Palatine of Hungary, to look into the rumors. What they discovered shocked even seasoned officials. Soldiers arrived at Cheste Castle in December 1610 and found a scene of unimaginable horror. Fresh corpses littered the grounds, torture devices still stained with blood, and survivors barely clinging to life. Testimonies described mutilations so extreme they defy belief. One survivor, Anna Hedviga, recounted how Elizabeth would bite pieces of flesh from her victims' shoulders and faces. Despite overwhelming evidence, Elizabeth's social standing protected her from immediate justice. A public trial would have exposed not just her crimes, but the complicity of the church, local authorities, and her powerful family. The monarchy, fearing scandal, could not allow a full public reckoning. Instead, a grim compromise was reached. Many of her servants were publicly executed, tortured, or burned alive to appease public outrage. Elizabeth herself was spared execution. Instead, she was sentenced to life imprisonment in her own castle, walled into a small room with only tiny openings for food and air. Isolated from the world she had ruled with terror, Elizabeth Bathory spent her final years descending into madness. She died in 1614, alone and forgotten, while the vast majority of her wealth and influence remained with her family. Her victims, the hundreds of girls whose lives were stolen, were lost to history. But Elizabeth's legacy lived on, not just in horror stories and myths about blood and immortality, but as a chilling example of how power and privilege can shield even the most monstrous behavior from justice. The story of Elizabeth Bathory reveals something profoundly disturbing. Cruelty and evil can flourish under systems designed to protect the powerful. For decades, society looked the other way, prioritizing wealth, status, and fear over human life. And for every victim forgotten by history, Elizabeth's actions serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority and obsession. Elizabeth Bathory's story didn't just end with her imprisonment. The consequences of her crimes rippled through history, inspiring myths, legends, and cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked power. Her obsession with youth, beauty, and blood became the foundation for centuries of vampire stories. But the real horror lies in the reality behind the legends. Hundreds of lives were destroyed, and society looked the other way for decades. Even in her confinement, Elizabeth retained a grim symbol of her influence. While she was walled into her cell, the castle and her family remained intact. The Bathory name carried weight, wealth, and social power, ensuring that while Elizabeth could no longer directly harm anyone, her family continued to prosper. Justice, in her case, was selective, tailored more by politics and influence than by morality. Her servants, those who had actively participated in the murders, paid the price publicly. Executed in gruesome fashion, they became scapegoats, satisfying the public's need for outrage while sparing Elizabeth herself from facing the full consequences of her actions. The psychological aspect of her story is as chilling as the physical violence she inflicted. Elizabeth genuinely believed in the efficacy of her rituals. She convinced herself that bathing in the blood of virgins could stop the aging process, that drinking it would rejuvenate her body, and that these acts were necessary for her survival and beauty. In her mind, she was not a monster, but a seeker of eternal youth, a practitioner of a twisted form of medieval science. Mirrors, servants' flattery, and her obsession with physical appearance all reinforced her delusion, creating a feedback loop that justified her crimes in her own perception. What makes Elizabeth's story even more remarkable and terrifying is how ordinary it seemed to those around her. Her peers, the local authorities, the clergy, and even neighboring nobles tolerated or ignored her actions. They may have suspected something was wrong, but the combination of her noble status, wealth, and political connections created an almost impenetrable shield. The very systems designed to maintain justice instead allowed her reign of terror to continue unchecked. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes evil flourishes not because it is hidden, but because society chooses to ignore it. Elizabeth's downfall came not because someone courageously challenged her in the moment, but because her overreach finally attracted the attention of individuals who could not be silenced. Targeting noble girls was her fatal mistake. Unlike peasant families, these victims had connections and influence, and when their children disappeared, authorities had no choice but to act. King Matthias and Georgius Thurzo's investigation exposed the systematic horror within Chete Castle, revealing the scale and methodology of her crimes. The discovery was so horrifying that even seasoned officials were shocked, forced to confront the limits of what human beings could endure and survive. While Elizabeth Bathory's confinement removed her ability to directly harm anyone else, the legacy of her crimes continued. The castle became synonymous with terror, her name became legendary, and her story served as a grim case study in the dark extremes of obsession, privilege, and cruelty. Writers, storytellers, and historians would retell her life for centuries, transforming her into the archetype of the aristocratic vampire. Yet, beneath the myth lies the truth. Elizabeth Bathory was not a mythical creature. She was human, with all the flaws, desires, and moral failures that led her to commit atrocities on a scale almost unimaginable. Her story also offers a stark lesson about the dangers of power left unchecked. Elizabeth's wealth, status, and network of influence allowed her to operate with impunity for decades. Hundreds of girls suffered and died while the social, political, and religious systems around her failed to protect the most vulnerable. In this sense, her legacy is not just one of blood and terror, but a cautionary tale about society's responsibility to hold the powerful accountable. History remembers her, not for beauty or heroism, but for cruelty and obsession, and the echoes of her reign of terror serve as a warning. When ambition and vanity go unchecked, the cost is measured in human lives. Ultimately, Elizabeth Bathory's story is both horrifying and instructive. It shows how obsession, delusion, and abuse of power can combine to create real-world monsters. It demonstrates the fragility of justice when social status and influence can override morality. And it reminds us that the line between legend and history can be frighteningly thin, because the truth of what happened at Chejde Castle is far more horrifying than any myth it inspired. For over 2 decades, she terrorized a region, exploiting the powerless while hiding behind her nobility. Even in the end, justice was partial, punishment selective, and the victims forgotten. Yet her story remains a timeless warning. Unchecked power, obsession with vanity, and societal indifference can lead to unimaginable cruelty. History has a way of repeating itself when these lessons are ignored, and the horrors of Elizabeth Bathory serve as a stark, unforgettable reminder of that reality.